Okay, so just a few things on Iraq, and I will post this. And my plan is then I will make this part a little assignment. I think I'm just going to give a little, very basic quiz next week on it, like 15 questions. So that's my plan. So Iraq War, and that's the bombing, the infamous shock and awe of Baghdad, where the United States bombed on, well, at the night, during the evening, on March 20th, 2003. By the way, they timed it so it would be exactly at the time for primetime news on that evening. In fact, I can vividly remember this because the NCAA basketball tournament was just beginning, and it was in Salt Lake City. And my wife and I got tickets, and we drove to Salt Lake City that evening of the 20th. And we were glued, kind of going back and forth the news and a book on tape, but going back and forth because we knew the war was probably going to start. It was kind of this surreal thing. And I remember getting up at the motel the next morning and going out for the little continental breakfast thing. And it was on the news, and it was just this surreal thing with the basketball tournament going on. It was just, it was really something. And I'm going to go, I put it through December 11, 2001. That's basically when technically the U.S. pulled out, even though the U.S. is still technically there, even though now it's just more advising. It's complex. But I'm going to get into the main issues of the war. And this is one that's seen in the very triumphant, we bombed, nothing can stop us. Iraq has no prayer. But this is the kind of scene that people never talked about. The kicking down the door and looking for potential insurgents. And the humiliation that so many, just one sec. Still on? Okay. The humiliation that so many Iraqis had when this was going on. And this is actually a pretty scary scene. But this is a little video that the events that led into the Iraq War. And I was going to watch just a little bit of this. Please say this is
March 1988, and more than 3,000 civilians were killed when Iraqi warplanes dropped nerve gas on the town of Halabja.
The bodies which litter this town were those of people who ran out of their houses to try to escape the gas.
So this is trying to tie what Iraq did in 1988 to the war. And it's BBC, it's pretty well done, but it gives you this background, and I'm going to be very clear about it. It's incredibly misleading, and I thought it'd be a good thing to show because even though it's better than most of the things you'll find about it.
2 years later, and then President of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, launched a surprise invasion of Kuwait. A huge military campaign led by the US forced him to back down. After the ceasefire, there were economic sanctions and UN inspectors appointed to oversee the destruction of chemical weapons. But Saddam Hussein didn't play along, and those inspectors soon left the country. Then there was 9/11. Within days, George W. Bush, then US President, had told his generals to plan for a possible war in Iraq.
States like these
that's true.
And their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
The White House repeatedly tried to connect Iraq to the 9/11 attacks, though those links later proved false. Bush then hosted Prime Minister Tony Blair in Texas. Blair's critics say it was at this point he secretly agreed to go to war. He denies that. Then President Bush went before the UN to make his case for disarming Iraq by force. The British government published its own dossier saying that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction that could be ready in 45 minutes.
The intelligence picture they paint is one accumulated over the last 4 years. It is extensive, detailed, and authoritative.
The government later admitted that intelligence was faulty and the 45-minute claim was wrong. By November, weapons inspectors had been allowed back, but Saddam Hussein was thought to be stalling. After one last summit, an ultimatum was given.
Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict.
So it's pretty good, but misleading.
The conflict was over quickly, or so it seemed. Then came the aftermath. It started with looting. It quickly became an organised insurgency. Saddam Hussein was captured and executed, but that didn't stop the violence. Pictures emerged showing the abuse of Iraqi prisoners by American troops.
Our country had an obligation to treat them right. We didn't, and that was wrong.
Violence between Shia and Sunni Muslims intensified. The murder rate in Baghdad tripled. The US solution was the surge, an extra 20,000 troops. The violence did appear to ease. The number of bombings fell.
I'll come back to that.
In April 2009, the UK ended combat operations. 179 British troops had lost their lives. The US withdrew 2 years later.
Now, Iraq's not a perfect place, but we're leaving behind a sovereign, stable, and self-reliant Iraq.
Since the start of the conflict, it's thought 179,000 civilians and at least 40,000 military personnel may have lost their lives. Successive Iraqi governments have struggled to maintain order. So-called Islamic State has taken control of swathes of the country, including the second city Mosul. As of today, attacks continue across Iraq.
Now, ISIL or ISIS has been basically defeated, but a nice little, it's not horrible. It kind of gives you an idea. I thought I'd just get a few things in here, but still, it's pretty misleading because you don't know why it all happened. And so let's move on. So let's get a little bit of the history. So the history, it's history because I have a map. And history of Iraq. And Iraq was created out of the aftermath of World War I. And so you look at this map of the Ottoman Empire, and the Arabs revolted against the Ottomans, helped the British and their colonial troops defeat the Ottoman Empire, and they were promised basically a pan-Arab state, an Arab state here. Well, of course, Britain and France were not going to allow that. They had secretly agreed to divide it up. These became British colonies. Baghdad, they created a place called Jordan, and they created a place called Palestine. And then Syria and Lebanon went to the French. Kuwait had been made a British colony back in 1899. And they made it for a very simple reason, to control the Persian Gulf. Now, they did that because they wanted to protect the road to India. But before World War I, Britain had made a series of unequal treaties with then Persia, today Iran, to scoop up most of their oil, and they wanted to do the same with Iraq. Now, there were lots of reasons why they wanted the oil in Iraq, but they created this colony for oil, partially because their navy operated on oil, partially because they want to break up the labor unions that were dominating the coal industry. I mean, this is it's an amazing history. But also they could see the future. Oil was going to become key. And so there were 3 separate provinces that made up the area between the rivers, or AKA Mesopotamia, another term for Mesopotamia, Iraq. And north was Mosul, and that was mostly Kurdish Sunni Muslims. The center area was Baghdad, which was a hodgepodge of different groups. Baghdad was an incredibly cosmopolitan city with Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Assyrians, Taziki. I mean, this is an incredible group. And then in the south called, wait a sec here, Basra, and those were mostly Sunni Shia Muslims. There's this motor going on. Winston Churchill actually was the head of British colonial service, and he was the one who would be responsible for putting on the first rebellion in Iraq in 1920 and 1921, because the people there expected to be independent. Instead, they were made part of a colonial kingdom under a man by the name of Faisal, who was the son of the Sharif of Medina, right down here. They'd helped the British during World War I. And they made him king. He was a colonial king, and that family would rule till 1958. Their brother would rule Jordan, and that family still rules Jordan today. So Jordan, in many ways, is the last colonial kingdom. It's still a colonial kingdom. And they rebelled, and Churchill suggested using chemical weapons. To give you an idea about the way the British thought of the people who lived there, yes, they used mustard gas. They put down the rebellion. There'd be a series of rebellions, but they controlled the oil. About 99% of the oil revenues from Mesopotamia, Iraq, went to Britain. And then World War II happened, And in World War II, actually there was a rebellion there helped by Nazi Germany to revolt against the British. And not that the people, the Arabs there, like Nazi Germany. It's the enemy, my enemy becomes my friend. But this would be brutally put down by the British. And Iraq held. But after the war, after World War II, Britain did not have the money or the support to hold these colonies, and nationalism that really took off after World War II meant that almost all their colonies, they would begin to lose. They begin to lose some control over Baghdad. They would give Jordan their independence, even though, like I said, it's a colonial kingdom. Palestine devolved in the Civil War and eventually the Israeli War of Independence. You're going to get Iran trying to break away. It's same with Yemen. I mean, this was a big time. Kuwait, as you can see, would break away in 1961. I know it says Iraq's independent in 1932, but it was a colonial kingdom. Britain still controlled the oil until 1958. And so, actually, the Cold War really began to take off there. You could see it with the creation of what's called the Baghdad Pact. Soon it would be called CENTO, the Central Asian Treaty Organization. What that meant was they're starting to try to surround the Soviet Union right here. And the British originally called it the Baghdad Pact. And the idea is we're going to form these anti-communist governments. But Iraq was already developing a very vibrant communist party. Iraq had very intense nationalist movements growing. And with the Cold War in the 1950s, the United States began to pressure Britain to let it be independent. To the American point of view, it would be better to have Iraq independent and on our side than Iraq fighting for independence and looking to Soviet help. And one of the reasons for that be what would happen in Iran in 1953. Iran, I've mentioned this before in my class, I mentioned it before in special topics, one of the most important events in the history of the United States in the Middle East. The U.S. overthrew a democratically elected government in Iran because we claim because of anti-communists, but also for the oil. And this would lead to the U.S. supporting dictatorships. They became part of the Baghdad Pact and then CENTO. And this had great influence on Iraq because Iran would be seen as a great success by the Americans. And so secretly, they begin to think we could do the same thing in Iraq. If Iran works so well, let's do it in Iraq. Let's get a pro-American, anti-communist government. Now, what happened in Iran, you can see this would trigger then event after event after event after event after event that would lead to almost all the problems today. And yes, it has direct relation to Iraq because it's next door. And the thought was we could do the same thing here and try to create a pro-American dictatorship. And in 1958, there was a military coup, sometimes called the Colonel's coup, and they overthrew the king. Sent the king packing, and they created a dictatorship. And this dictatorship at first was seen as, well, this is great for America. We have another Iran, another dictator. But the problem was, and thus the relation to Iran, they seem to be too close to the commies. The relatively strong communist party in Iraq was allowed into the government, and even though it was by no means a communist government, they had to work together. And so to the United States, this is unacceptable. And the U.S., as a direct result of this, would put troops into Lebanon and also begin to rethink its attitude towards the brand new nation of Israel, which the U.S. was not very close to, but began to arm them and also arm Saudi Arabia. But that's another story for down the road. Oh, and just pouring in weapons to Iran. So out of this is going to become the Ba'ath Party. And I have no idea why they did that little circle, by that shape thing, but the Ba'ath Party. And the Ba'ath Party was a party actually all over the Arab world. It was an ultra-nationalist party. Ultra-nationalist, but intensely anti-communist. So they had help with the CIA. But there were Ba'athist parties in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. All over. In fact, Gamir Nasser would become the Ba'athist leader or connected to the Ba'ath Party in Egypt. and would become a symbol of Arab nationalism. In Syria, the Ba'ath Party would take over, and Assad, the current dictator, his father was the first Ba'athist leader. Ultra-nationalist, and intensely anti-communist. Saddam Hussein became a member of the Ba'ath Party. In fact, when the Ba'athists at first tried to overthrow that the government of the four colonels, it's sometimes called, when he first tried to overthrow it, he was one of the attempted assassins who had to run away to Cairo. But the CIA helped him in Cairo. He became a client of the CIA, anti-communism. And with help of the United States, he moved to the top of the Ba'athist Party. And so when he came back to Iraq, we're not clear, but almost certainly he had money from the CIA to help him get back to Baghdad. The Ba'athists would overthrow the government in 1963 and create a rabidly anti-communist government. They were overthrown in 66, and then the Ba'athists came back in 68. So needless to say, Iraq went through in the 1960s a pretty violent time, and yes, this was a time of a lot of Arab nationalism against Israel. The Six-Day War in 1967, where Israel crushed its neighbors, partially with the use of air power and the growing predominance of oil and the importance of that. So the 60s, and then the Cold War and the Vietnam War. The new leader was a Ba'athist by the name of al-Bakr. But Bakr was more and more as into the 1970s, became more and more of a figurehead. Saddam Hussein was his number two, but Hussein was moving up in the ranks. Now, it was clear that Hussein was a very violent and dangerous leader, but at the same time, Hussein was intelligent and somebody who was rabidly anti-communist. So the United States had mixed feelings about Hussein, but he created that government was intensely secular. They were especially, well, let's put it this way, intensely secular for the Middle East. So this was not a religious government. Did I put secular? Yeah, secular, that's right. Not a religious government at all. Yet most of the Ba'ath Party were made up of Arab Sunni Muslims. They made up less than 17% of the population of Iraq. Most of the Sunni Muslims lived in an area around Baghdad and just to the northwest of Baghdad. During the Iraq War, we called it the Sunni Triangle. But they were Arab Sunni Muslims. And there was not a lot of religious animosity, but there was always that fear amongst the Sunnis that maybe the Shia majority, which made up about 60% of the population, might want more power, especially when there's a very large Shia-dominated country next door and a constant rival of Iraq, Iran. So they went through rapid modernization in the 1970s. In fact, without a doubt, Iraq became the most modern country in the Middle East outside of Israel. They had modern cities, high education, it was secular, more women's rights than any other country in the Middle East, including Turkey, and any other Middle East country except for Turkey and Israel, but even more in Turkey. And that's why the picture I show you of Baghdad University and women walking through in the 1970s, dressed like you would look at that picture and think that's in Los Angeles. And an incredibly elaborate electrical system. They had clean water. Their infant mortality rate went down like a rock, and so life expectancy was higher there than almost all their neighbors. And even though it was a dictatorship, it was a quasi-socialist government, most of them are Hussein, who made sure that people had the best health care in that region of the country, of the Arab world. I mean, Iraq was a pretty amazing place, but at the same time, it had a brutal dictator in power. You know, that's dictators in power, and a lot of internal rivalries. One of the things about dictators is that a constant need to increase power, to increase control, and fear of neighbors. There are all kinds of border disputes. They have border disputes about Kuwait, especially now that oil is being discovered right on the border. And Iran about access to the sea. And so these border disputes would spew up all the time, especially when there was the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1978. And it's no coincidence that this Islamic Revolution in 1978 in Iran, and for some reason I didn't put that down, but I'm getting this clear. In Iran in 1978, I thought I typed that in. Maybe I did and erased it, but because I accidentally did something that erased some of the stuff I did originally. Good times. But Iran, when this Islamic Revolution happened, even though it was a complex revolution that involved people who wanted a democracy, but also people who wanted a sectarian state dominated by Shia clerics, this terrified Iraq. Because the thought was, if a Shia-dominated sectarian state could form in Iran, the same thing could happen in Iraq. No, they never believed that Iran would invade. It might trigger this. It's at the same time that the Soviets, fearful that this might spread into Afghanistan or into their regions of southern Soviet Union that were Muslim-dominated, that they would invade to make sure a puppet government remained in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan has been at war since 1979 too. I mean, this is this hinge moment right here. Just as the Cold War is getting bigger and it looks closer and closer that World War III could happen, and then in 1979, using that as an excuse, Hussein takes power. So oust al-Bakr, and there's Hussein, a former CIA client, not getting direct U.S. aid, but indirect U.S. aid. Also some aid from the French. I mean, he's got money, so they're selling him weapons. And he almost immediately, but remember, he's been behind the scenes wielding power. He thinks this is the perfect time to knock Iran out. If they knock Iran out, they could get big territorial gains that includes not only access to the sea, but oil, but also totally deter a potential revolution in southern Iran where the Sunni Muslims live, or for that matter, in the north for the Kurds. And thus would trigger a horrific Iran-Iraq war. This, Hussein thought, would be a very quick war, a couple months war. Iran would sue for peace. And basically he was hoping for most of this area right here. And what Iraq did is, they know Iran had a lot of weapons, very advanced weapons, but the United States quit selling them weapons in 1978 after the Islamic Revolution, and then U.S. put an embargo on Iran after Iranians stormed the U.S. embassy and took Americans hostage, which happened at the same time. And so Hussein let it be known that he's going to invade, and the United States secretly approved. And for much of the war, Iraq would be helped by the United States. And so, I already said that. Fear of Shia, Iraq attacked. I forgot to hit to click that. So, after an initial quick invasion, the Iraqi advance bogged down. It did not go as they thought. They thought air power would knock them down. They just kind of ride in a few miles, sue for peace. It didn't quite happen. The air power didn't knock out Iran the way they thought. They rolled in, and Iran not only fought hard, but eventually they began to counterattack. And soon they pushed the Iraqis back into the border, almost back to the border of Iraq-Iran. And almost all their gains were lost, very quickly. And it evolved into a horrific trench war, as close as you get to World War I, for almost 7 years. A bloody, awful war. And it was clear after a couple months that there's going to be no victory. Iraq should have sued for peace, but they were unwilling to back down. And Iran, this gave the Islamic government an excuse to create a true Islamic state. This is where it comes from. The state that's in Iran now came out of this. And you can see all of this going back to the 53 Iraq War. But in 1981, the Tammuz 1 nuclear reactor, it's right about here. Iraq purchased a nuclear reactor from France. They also had a lot of French weapons, especially pretty good French fighter planes. And Mirage F1s, they're called. But they made a lot of money. France was not doing it because, oh, let's help our buddies Iraq. It's dollar signs. They built a nuclear reactor. Now, one of the things Iraq really wanted was a more secure electrical grid and the secure electrical grid, and this would allow them to sell even more oil. Well, it also might be able to be used to make nuclear weapons. And Israeli fighter planes bombed and destroyed this reactor. Actually, the United States protested this bitterly, which is very ironic. But they destroyed this reactor. As it turned out, because of this reactor, they were relatively close to potentially making a nuclear bomb, an atomic bomb. And that's a big deal down the road. But U.S. and its Western allies actually kind of played both sides. The U.S. and Israel, ironically, did supply arms to Iran, which would be the Iran-Contra scandal. The United States would use the proceeds of that to illegally help guerrillas, Contra guerrillas, fighting the government of Nicaragua, and also death squads. It was a... Okay, so with that, but mostly helped Iraq. The U.S. gave intelligence. The U.S. sent... intelligence was a biggie. A lot of spare parts, a lot of weapons, and the U.S. also encouraged its allies. West Germany sold a lot of weapons to Iraq and a lot to Iran. West Germany kind of cleaned up. France sold weapons, Britain sold weapons, Belgium sold weapons, Spain sold weapons. I mean, people were making a lot of money off of this war. But mostly Iraq. The United States and the West, we didn't want a true victor between the two. We wanted a stalemate. But by then, neither side was willing to back down. So the U.S. wanted a stalemate. And it would be at this time that the U.S. started aiding with the sale of chemical weapons to Iraq. By 1985, when Iran did a massive offensive using just human wave attacks, God, this was bloody. The United States sold... Well, the U.S. sold components and that could be used for anthrax and sarin nerve gas, which I just put as chemical weapons. It's more complex than that. West Germany sold mustard gas. Hey, didn't Germany create mustard gas in World War I? Huh, the circle is completed. Oh, here's a funny story. West Germany sold Iraq mustard gas to use against the Iranians. And then they sold the Iranians gas masks. You can't make this up. But the U.S. and them sold weapons because Iran was using their clear advantage in numbers. There's a lot more Iranians. And Iraq was reluctant to use Shia soldiers because of the Islamic Revolution. And there was fear that there might be a rebellion around Basra of Shia, and up here, the Kurds. So they begin to use gas attacks, and it's estimated as many as 3/4 of Iraqi artillery shells by 1987 were mustard gas. In fact, a sarin gas attack in 87 killed tens of thousands of Iranians and ended one of their offensives. And so this was a brutal, horrific war. But then the Kurds in northern Iraq revolted. And the Kurds had revolted back in the 70s, back in the 50s for independence. And Kurds live in part of Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. And so you can imagine Iran was trying to help the Kurds revolt. And to Turkey, the Kurds are a mortal enemy. And Syria, which is closer to Iran than Iraq, which is kind of weird because they were both Ba'athist governments for a while, they also helped them. The Kurds thought they had support of the United States. They did in the 70s, and the U.S. pulled back. But what Saddam Hussein did, they mentioned at the beginning of that video, they used mustard gas and sarin and some anthrax, but anthrax didn't work very well. Anthrax is important, though, to attack the Kurds, and they killed anywhere from 100,000 to 200,000 Kurds in 86 or 87 and 88. And not only was this idea of total war, the idea we have an enemy within and we must knock them out, but that horrible logic also was terror. They won't do it again. And this was the gas that the U.S. helped them get. And this will be used then later on as one of the justifications to invade Iraq. They used gas on their own people. The war would end in 88 with a status quo antebellum treaty. This might sound familiar to some of you. That treaty means to go back to the way it was before the war. And this would be like the War of 1812, would be a status quo antebellum treaty. And so here's a couple pictures of the trench warfare. And these are Iraqi soldiers in a trench. These are Iranian soldiers. Horrific fighting. It was so awful how bad the Iran-Iraq war was. 1 million soldiers would be killed, significantly more Iranians, but the Iranian economy was destroyed, and that 70s miracle for Iraq ended. They were in debt. Much of their people were destroyed. Hussein had to become much more of a greater and horrific dictator to prove what kind of dictator he was. He was horrific. And this destroyed much of their armed forces. Even though they had a huge army, they had been beaten to the ground by attrition and weapons. I mean, Hussein was in big trouble. And this shows what a terrible decision was to invade. What a terrible decision. And this is going to directly lead to the Gulf War. Now, the Gulf War was Iraq. One other problem. After the Iraq war ended, oil prices were really low. The beginning of the decade, oil prices were super high. But by the end of the decade, especially once the war ended, everybody started pumping as much as possible, and prices dropped. Iraq and blamed Kuwait. Remember, they already had border differences, and both countries are created by Britain. So there's no like ancient Kuwait. And Iraq, as we know it, didn't quite exist. So these are artificial colonial countries, and they had border disputes over this area right here. Now, Saudi Arabia and Iraq still have border disputes here. They blame Kuwait. And they also blame Kuwait for drilling, angle drilling it's called, but drilling under the border and stealing Iraqi oil. Now, I got to be clear about this. Kuwait was a nasty dictatorship, a brutal state that essentially had slave labor, where they would bring in people from other countries to work off, or the other way to put at it is indentured servants. And Iraq actually went to the United States and said, would you be okay if we take care of Kuwait? And they seemed to get the go-ahead. The ambassador to Iraq, April Gillespie, said, don't worry about it. In fact, what she said was honest. The actual quote was, the United States has no interest in border disputes between Kuwait and Iraq. And to Saddam Hussein, that meant that the United States has no problem with them invading Kuwait. To this day, we don't know what really went on there. Was the United States baiting Iraq to attack? The Cold War is just ending. There was a real fear that there'd be a cutback in the military and therefore military spending. There was desire for oil. Oil prices were tanking. Oil companies in Texas were losing their shirt and having to plug up wells. I don't know. To this day, we don't know. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it all seemed to roll together. In 1990, they invaded Kuwait. The Kuwaiti army was relatively small, but they had been told to stand down and not worry. The United States assured them that nothing would happen right before the Iraqis invaded. The whole thing's very odd. But Kuwait quickly fell. And a week later, all of a sudden, George Bush says that Iraq is the greatest threat to America. Saddam Hussein is a dictator, start comparing him to Hitler. And we sent U.S. troops. We convinced Saudi Arabia that Iraq was going to invade Saudi Arabia. And we sent troops called Desert Shield to prevent this. Now, this was a blatant lie. The U.S. had no evidence in 1990 that Iraq was going to invade Saudi Arabia. And we know for a fact that Iraq was not going to invade Saudi Arabia, but we told them they were. And Saudi Arabia would allow troops, and that was a big deal, because that's the first time that that non-sectarian or troops from secular non-Muslim governments were allowed into Saudi Arabia. And that's a big deal, because that's where Medina and Mecca are, the two most holy spots in the Islamic world. This will have impact down the road. Well, Iraq stayed in Kuwait, and Bush built up a massive coalition, and they try to present it as all these countries coming together to stop aggression. There's over 30 countries would send at least some troops, but mostly it was just bribes. Like the U.S. told Egypt, we'll quit giving you $4 billion of aid a year unless you send troops. Egypt sent troops. Britain sent some troops. France sent some troops. It was mostly the American troops, 550,000 U.S. troops. Many of them were in West Germany. With the Cold War ending, they just shipped them to Iraq. And the Gulf War would begin in 1991. Actually, Hussein was ready to pull out, and so the U.S. hurried up the invasion and attacked. We don't know if he would have pulled out. That's one of those, but he said he would. And here, by the way, is the invasion. These are the oil wells. And for the first 4 weeks, Allied air power, those are British Tornado bombers, totally devastated the Iraqi defenses. Iraqi defenses, they had over 100 planes, but the planes were relatively old and no match to U.S. planes. They were either Soviet planes or French planes, but they were French, like second-class planes made for export, and no match for the modern U.S., British, and French fighters. And quickly it devolved into an air war where the U.S. completely destroyed major elements of the Iraqi army. And then after the army was destroyed, there was not some real issues with it, but they were able, the invasion, kind of a big arc to cut off the Iraqis in Kuwait, and the war ended relatively quickly after the initial air power. And here is, they called it the road to death, where tens of thousands of civilians and Iraqi soldiers were killed by Allied air power, mostly American and British bombers, trying to escape. But the big thing was, here is Iraq being bombed. There was Baghdad. This is in 1991. He's selling food with the destruction in Baghdad. And there was victory. But the decision was made to allow Hussein to stay in power. And with that, the Kurds in the north and the Shia in the south were encouraged to revolt. The U.S. encouraged them, said, we will help you. We will, please revolt. And with Hussein, his army destroyed, he lost control of most of Iraq. It looked like it might secede. This is going into February of 1991. But the U.S. made it very clear they're not going to come to the aid of the Kurds or the Shia, and Iraq crushed the rebellion. One of the big things is, and that's actually destroyed Iraqi gunship, a Soviet plane or Soviet helicopter they sold to Iraqis. They stopped the Iraqi Air Force from flying, but they allowed helicopters, which just devastated the Kurds. Tens of thousands will try to flee. This is them going over the mountains into Anatolia, into Turkey, and it was a disaster. Tens of thousands would be killed, and Saddam Hussein stayed in power. And I did not mean to cover that up, but let me read you what it said. Saddam Hussein stayed in power, and the big thing, though, Iraq was destroyed by the war. And it says civilian infrastructure was targeted by the United States. The U.S. knocked out almost all the electrical facilities. The U.S. knocked out all the sewage plants. The U.S. knocked down the clean water facilities. The U.S. bombed hospitals. The U.S. bombed any kind of food distribution or food supply or warehouses. The U.S. tried to make the civilian life as miserable as possible, with the idea being if they want to overthrow Hussein, they'll overthrow him because they're starving. And it's never been fully rebuilt. The Iraqi electrical grid today is not near as strong as it was in 1990. And that should give you an idea of what Iraq has gone through. And so Iraq never recovered from this. There was raw sewage running into people's basements. That still goes on to this day. Iraq was destroyed, its military was destroyed, much of its infrastructure was destroyed, and it remains destroyed, and that was on purpose, with the idea being that will crush Hussein and keep him weak. Well, they quickly adopted no-fly zones, and there's no-fly zones in the north, no-fly zones in the south. The original one has moved north, and this was a leaflet dropped to, if any Iraqis try to send weapons or do anything down in this area here, they'll be bombed by those American F-16s. It was ostensibly to protect the Kurds in the north and the Shia in the south. Kurds in the north, forgot to put that down. And U.S. and British plane patrolled it. But this would be an excuse. They kept bombing these areas for much of the war. So virtually, especially by 2003, they kept bombing and bombing and bombing. Constant bombing. And a couple of things about the post-war then. So, after the war ended, the realization hit that Saddam Hussein was actually working on this nuclear program much faster than anyone thought. And so they put economic sanctions. The United Nations sanctions were shockingly harsh. And the U.S. Made sure they would be harsh. Russia, which the Soviet Union was ending, kind of went along. And China just basically, China didn't vote. They abstained from it. And these sanctions, combined with the war, would lead to a spike, one of the largest spikes in history of infant mortality rates. Went up dramatically. Now, when I remember in the mid-1990s, and you hear this over and over again, that over 500,000 Iraqi children died because of the sanctions. In fact, this was accepted as the norm. In fact, when U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who was Clinton's Secretary of State in 1997, was asked about this. She was asked, 500,000 children are dying because of the sanctions. Should we keep doing them? And she said, yeah, it's worth it. And that was accepted. It might not have been that high. It's really hard to tell, but a New England Journal of Medicine study said anywhere from 200,000 to 500,000 children died. So the point about these sanctions are, Iraq was devastated by war. And remember, they've already fought a horrific war for 8 years earlier. And then they couldn't rebuild. They couldn't rebuild. So they never got, well, okay. They got electricity going again. In fact, that's kind of would become a dark joke after the 2003 invasion. But never to the same level. There would be brownouts. But they had electricity going. But there was still sewage issues, clean water issues, all kinds of problems. They never recovered. Food shortages, and so the sanctions were very brutal. They began an oil for food program beginning in 1995, and at first Hussein disagreed, but eventually would accept it. But it became a big grift. They began stealing from a grift means a swindle. And Hussein started funneling money on the top and making murals like this, which would be one of his palaces. So he, the money was not going to the people, and a lot of people inside Iraq and a lot of outside traders, middlemen, got super rich. But the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is part of the United Nations, they would send inspectors as part of the deal. Sanctions will end if you let inspectors in. And when they end, they found these sites, and this is some of the areas they found, sites to work on various parts of the Iraqi nuclear program. And they had been developing it spread out because of the Israeli bombing 15 years earlier. But as it turned out, they were closer than what the United States thought. And they proceeded to destroy all of the atomic program and also all the chemical and biological weapons programs. Remember, most of that, though, they got from the West, including the United States. So they destroyed it. And, well, they weren't 100% sure. There were other places they wanted to check, but Hussein, by 96, was becoming more confident as international anger, and this is actually a protest outside of Iraq against sanctions. This is actually in the Sudan. But one more thing I must mention. In 1993, George H.W. Bush, after he lost for re-election, he went to Kuwait and immediately came out that there was an attempted assassination attempt. And President Clinton, the brand new president, used that as an excuse to bomb Baghdad and would set the precedent for bombing Baghdad for the next decade. Constant bombing outside of the no-fly zones. As it turned out, there is no evidence, and now we are 99.9999999% sure there was no assassination attempt on George Herbert Walker Bush, even though I hear people say that all the time. And so, here's Clinton as president. A couple big things happen right away. First off, Clinton, with Clinton in office, Hussein's son-in-law in 1996, just as there's becoming a little bit more acrimony between the inspectors and Hussein, his son-in-law, Al-Majid, he fled to Jordan. And he was part of the atomic I forgot to have clicks here, but atomic weapons program. And he confirmed that there's nothing left. There's no weapons program. Now, in the strange way that families work, he was invited back to Iraq. Hussein said, "You'll be welcome with open arms." And so he and his brother came back to Iraq. Remember, he's Saddam Hussein's son-in-law. And he was there for 6 months. He made a big deal about it. He came back. He's welcome with open arms. And then, of course, he was murdered. He was shot in the head. Meat hooks were put into his eyes, his eye sockets, and they dragged him around the city of Tikrit. That's how Hussein took care of his family. But it was clear there was no weapon. But inspectors in 1996 would leave. And partially because Hussein, everyone blamed Hussein, said Hussein kicked him out. That's not quite what happened. The inspectors basically searched everywhere, and they wanted to keep searching. Hussein was saying, "We have nothing left. We must maintain some kind of sovereignty. We're not going to let you search." Now, part of it, he didn't want people to know all the money he was stealing, but they were kicked out. And that would be the excuse to keep the sanctions on, even though Iraq did not have a weapons program, and we know that is true with 100% certitude. But in 1998, a group of terrorists that were funded by this shadowy entity called Al-Qaeda. It was not really a terrorist group. It was just a few guys who funded it. A certain one you might have heard of named Osama bin Laden. Don't think of them as a group of terrorists, like this little cabal of diehard terrorists. No, they just funded terrorists. And they were partially in Afghanistan, partially in Sudan. They bombed U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. Clinton, the brand new president, not brand new president, I say, he'd been president for 6 years. He ordered retaliation, massive retaliations. So this is in Nairobi, Kenya. They bombed training facilities that Al-Qaeda set up for potential terrorists. They would pay for them to come in there and they would train using cruise missiles right here. They also bombed an aspirin factory in Sudan, claiming it was a chemical weapons factory, killed 20 people. As it turned out, it was an aspirin factory, and so they just killed innocent people. And this would be one of the many stepping stones to devolve the civil war in Sudan. No comment. But when I said ended negotiations, the brand new government of Taliban, which the U.S. had pretty good relations, they were talking about building a pipeline through Afghanistan for oil. The Taliban, which the U.S. had aided during their war against Russia, the United States was negotiating to get Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Because the United States blamed Osama bin Laden for a couple of terrorist attacks in Saudi Arabia, but also the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center in New York City. And it was all ready to do it, and then the United States bombed here. And negotiations broke off with the Taliban. And this is one of those what-ifs in history. Because Osama bin Laden was just simply a money guy. He wanted to act like a big-time terrorist, but he was just the money guy. He just organized it. He was not really this. He was from a rich Saudi Arabian family. In fact, his family, including him, was involved in George W. Bush's first business, an oil business. But Clinton then really began to demonize Hussein. And in 2000, the Iraqi Liberation Act was signed that said the U.S. is going to wants regime change in Iraq. And in 2000 they started sending money to the Iraqi National Congress. That's Ahmed Shalabi. Started in 2000. In 1998, in response to what was seen as not obeying the sanctions, the U.S. began Operation Desert Fox, which was sustained bombing of Baghdad. And then there was more bombing in the no-fly zones. Basically what happened is the ratcheting up the anger and the demonization of Hussein. In fact, this is when I remember Hussein was the villain for everything. Heck, he was the villain. They would talk about, oh no, it's Hussein on the sitcom Seinfeld. Well, one of my favorite movies, the Big Lebowski. Hussein is the villain. It's actually pretty amazing. But in 2000, the USS Cole in Yemen, American frigate, a suicide bomber, got a little motorboat, but another one of those guys who was the money came from Al Qaeda, attacked this U.S. frigate in Yemen. And so it just set up this ratcheting up of potential fear of terrorist attack. And then in 2001, George W. Bush was elected. But we have to give a little bit of background with the Bush. And just a couple of minutes, I'm going to quit. A couple of little background. The Progress for the New American Century, an organization that included Dick Cheney, who would become Bush's vice president. Then he was the CEO of an oil company named Halliburton, who made a lot of money in Iraq. They set this idea that the United States will be the main power of the 20th century through the power of American military. They will be able to control the world and use that to control oil, which they will use as leverage to maintain American control. And so they're already talking about taking out Iraq. Now, Cheney, back in 1991, was George Herbert Walker Bush's Secretary of War, or Secretary of Defense. And he recommended to George H.W. Bush, don't invade, don't do it. Iraq, Hussein should stay in power to balance out Iraq, balance out Iran. Now in 1998, he sees Hussein as laughing in our face and we must evade. Well, virtually all the members of the PNAC, all of them were allies, the program for a new American century. They all became members of or chief advisors of the presidency of George W. Bush. In 2000, in a very contested election where he did not win the popular vote, George W. Bush would be the president, the Republican from Texas. His father was George H. Walker Bush. And he would talk all the time about they killed my daddy. And he told almost immediately, secretly, almost immediately, they're talking about how do we get rid of Hussein? How do we get rid of Hussein? What must we do? So they're talking about it right away. And they ignored advice from the Clinton administration about there's real terrorist threats and there's a shadowy group we don't really understand called Al Qaeda to watch out for. And they continued bombing Iraq and the no-fly zones. In fact, stepped it up for the next 2 years. Those are F-16s in a base in Turkey. And they also increased tensions with China. This is an American patrol plane, a P-3. You see how the end is kind of crushed in right there? It was flying very close to the Chinese coast, and a Chinese fighter plane rammed it, was buzzing it, rammed it, and the plane barely made it down. And it seemed to be saying, like, God, we might go to war with China. And in August, Bush was even warned that bin Laden was spending a lot of money, going to attack the United States. He ignored it because, well, frankly, there are other issues going on. And then September 11th. And it became very clear that Al Qaeda was the money people behind it. Al Qaeda, as you might think about it now, as this organization, relatively loose, but organization of terrorists, all lumped together as Al Qaeda, it would begin after 9/11. Before 9/11, it was just Al Qaeda was bin Laden organizing money to try to get terrorists, paying for them, the money men, to do it. But they did a spectacular effort. By the way, that's all it was. They basically shot their bolt. They had nothing else. And the reasons they gave for doing it was U.S. influence in the Middle East, especially U.S. troops that were still in Saudi Arabia. Israel and their occupation of the West Bank, but the sanctions on Iraq. Now, that's the reasons they gave. It's obviously more complex than that, but those were the reasons. As they see it, the U.S. is supporting secular dictatorships and have to be stopped. The Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who was an old Cold Warrior from back in the 1970s, the day of September 11th, when they were meeting in the absolute, panicky meeting, it shouldn't have, but it took him totally by surprise. He was asking about Iraq. It's hard to see, but there's notes from his advisors. But it's basically saying, can we hit, you see this right here, it says SH, Saddam Hussein. So we can say it's not only Osama bin Laden, is it also Saddam Hussein? They're already talking about this without evidence. It's like, yes, now we can get Iraq. We can get them. We can get them. So even though they wanted, Bush at least was convinced to focus on Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda, which really wasn't much, but they were still had a base in Afghanistan and indirectly protected by the Taliban because Afghanistan's in the middle of the Civil War. A week after this, there were mail attacks with anthrax all over the Washington, D.C. area. Reporters, members of Congress, a few postal carriers were killed, were murdered by this anthrax. Just a week after. Remember, Hussein had anthrax. And this goes back to the Iraq War, and that came directly from the United States. To this day, we don't know who did it. No idea. It was not Iraq. We know that for certain. 100% certitude. But we don't know. By 10 days afterwards, the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency, they had already told Bush Hussein was not linked at all. 10 days afterwards, not linked, not at all. Yet that would be basically ignored. In October, the United States would attack the Taliban in Afghanistan, get involved in that civil war. That would turn someone to invasion, and that became the forever war. The U.S. is still in Afghanistan today. And also, you're going to get the Patriot Act being signed, Department of Homeland Security. And, wow, this one, I always go longer than I think. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop it right here. I'm going to spend about 15 minutes on Monday and finish this up, and then do rock and roll. Sound good? God, it's always so much. I will put this up, and then my plan is on next week, I'm just going to put up for you to do at your leisure. I'll put it up on Tuesday, like a 20-question quiz on Iraq. Sound good? All right. If there's no questions, I am out of here, and I'll finish up. I'm just doing the events that led up to war. Lots of stuff happened. And the problem with this is I know a lot, so I'm always wanting to add things. I lived through it, and it was very close to my mind, and I have to be honest, I was totally opposed to the war. I thought it was insane. And I was in a distinct minority, and I'll tell you more about that on Monday. On that happy